So I think of all the things that people say on the alt-right, the libertarian right, the dissident right, whatever, the thing that I disagree with the most is when people keep saying you got to leave the city and move to a small town or a rural area. And I know I've talked about this a lot, but I think I really got to get into the reasons why. Now, I'm not trying to say that all small towns or rural areas are the same. And I'm really speaking from a North American perspective here. I can't really say too much on the subject of small towns in Europe because I've never lived in one. And to be honest, from what I've seen, a lot of the small towns in Europe seem to be a lot more scenic and beautiful than the small towns here. However, when looking at small towns here, I think there is a tendency among right-wingers to over-idealize the small town and rural life. They, to some extent, exaggerate the problems in the cities and then under-exaggerate the problems outside the cities. So what are those problems? I'm going to get into them right now. And again, I'm not saying that every small town is the same in the same way that not every city is the same. For instance, there's some small towns like Banff or Canmore that are in tourist areas in the mountains and have a whole lot of things to do and are not boring at all. But I am going to get into the issues with small towns and rural areas overall. Number one, there's more obesity. It's just a simple fact. If you look at maps of where obesity is and studies, it is simply proven that in North America, there is more obesity in small towns and rural areas compared to in the big cities. And I think a big part of the reason for this is that people in the big cities tend to take public transit more, whereas people in small towns and rural areas tend to drive everywhere. And I think people who drive everywhere are more likely to be obese. And also it might have to do with the type of food they eat and the quantities, because I know a lot of restaurants I've been to in small towns and rural areas, it's really like, kind of like really fattening food and really large servings often. Like you won't find many like health conscious, like Freshie or stuff like that. You won't find stuff like that too much in small towns. And don't get me wrong, I love burgers, I love pizza, I love fried chicken, but at the same time, if that's the only food to eat, if you want to eat out, then yeah, you're going to probably get fat. So that's the first thing. The second, drug addiction. Now, obviously, there's plenty of drug addiction in the cities too. However, specifically the opioid and crystal meth epidemics, I believe, have disproportionately affected rural areas and small towns. And I mean, I've seen some of that personally myself in my own experience. I did live in a small town for a while, so I do know what I'm talking about. Again, like there's problems with homelessness, huge problems with homelessness in the big cities too, but at the same time, this drug addiction issue in the small towns, it's not something to be ignored or swept under the rug. To be honest, you'll probably find drug addiction almost everywhere. The only place where you don't really find this sort of thing is in wealthy upper middle class suburbs. I would say it is probably to some extent a big city problem and a small town problem, whereas it's not as much a suburban problem, at least the wealthy suburbs. There's plenty of people snorting coke and smoking weed in the wealthy suburbs and dropping acid and stuff like that, but there's not as much like, crystal meth and people doing that kind of thing in like open view and stuff like that. So I guess that's one thing. I'm not going to say drug addiction is a small town or rural problem per se, but it's a problem that exists in small towns and rural areas at a level that is at least maybe comparable to many of the cities. Okay, other problems. Here's a big one, and here's one that a lot of people don't actually think of when they move to a rural area, and it's actually very counterintuitive, is there's often a lack of parks and pathways to walk or bike on. Now, everybody thinks, oh, I moved to a small town, I moved to a rural area, there's going to be so much more open space. But what they don't tell you is that a lot of that open space is privately owned. It's owned by some farmer who will shoot you with his shotgun if he catches you trespassing on his land. Get the hell out of my property, you son of a bitch. Yeah, like that is what a lot of the land in rural areas is. And in fact, if you look at Google Street View, if you look at the farm belt, you'll see that the areas that have the most forests are actually often the big cities, like Chicago, for instance, or Omaha or Des Moines. That you'll find more forests in these cities than in the surrounding rural areas because often pretty much all the trees have been cut down for the sake of agriculture. And that's one thing you'll really notice in a lot of the the heartland. And when people say move to a small town, they often seem to mean the heartland specifically, which in my opinion is the most boring and lacking in scenery of any part of North America. Not to mention lacking in trees. I mean, other parts, like I think a small town in the Northeast, for instance, may not be as boring as a small town in the heartland. But honestly, from my experience in the heartland, like these small towns seem like the most boring place imaginable. There's no trees, there's no pathways, there's no nothing really. And I mean, that's a huge thing you gotta keep in mind. Like in the cities, there's often huge parks and trail systems, both in the inner cities and in the suburbs. Whereas in small towns, there's often very little in the way of trees, parks, trails, pathways, anything of that sort. And that's one thing I think a lot of people really don't know about these small towns. Again, it depends where you are, right? Like if you're in a small town out in the Rocky Mountains, that's a very different story. But a lot of these small towns in the heartland and the Midwest in particular have this issue in the farm belt. And that's a huge thing to keep in mind. Okay, so other issues. One issue I find in a lot of small towns is that the second that Walmart moves in, it just kills all the small businesses. Whereas in big cities, the cities are big enough that you can have a wide array of like local restaurants, local bars, local pubs. But in these small towns, they're often so small that they can't, like most of the local businesses can't survive the arrival of major chain stores. And for all this talk about small town people being more wholesome, I find in some ways they seem to prefer chain stores more than big city people do. A lot of big city people like these like, small restaurants, small cafes and stuff, but it seems like in a small town the second that like Walmart or McDonald's or Subway arrives, everybody just flocks there and ignores the local restaurants. Like a lot of these local restaurants in small towns don't seem to be doing very well. And that was true even before the nasty COVID shit started. So, I mean, that's another thing to keep your eye on about small towns. One other thing is there is some truth to the idea that a lot of small town people have an insular mentality. Now, obviously this can be used as an insult unfairly by like liberal urbanites who call themselves open-minded but are really the least open-minded people around. Like they will ruin your life if you disagree with them on anything politically. However, there is some truth to the idea that small town people do tend to be pretty insular. A lot of them, they rarely leave these towns. They've never lived anywhere else. They've barely ever been anywhere else. They seem to like marry whoever like was their first boyfriend or girlfriend from like grade school. Like they are pretty insular. There is some truth to that. And a lot of them do lack a certain knowledge about the wider world, which can make them a bit boring to have a conversation with if you want to talk about like travel or geography or history or other countries, other parts of your own country for that matter. Like a lot of them just aren't that knowledgeable and very insular. And it also means that a lot of them, they're not going to really like they're not going to stand up for their right to have vacation time, that's for sure, because they're not going to do anything with that vacation time. So that's another issue. And the final issue is that this idea that small town people are all conservative, I mean, yes, they are more conservative on average than in the big cities. However, when I lived in a small town, I was disappointed to find that a lot of the people around me were liberals. Not only liberals, but like in some ways worse liberals than the ones I've encountered in the city. I'm not trying to say that like there are more liberals in small towns and cities, but I'm saying plenty of them do exist, especially among the younger generation, especially among millennial and Gen Z women. A lot of them are still liberals, and a lot of them can be especially venomous liberals. Like those of them in small towns who are liberals are often more fanatical and more venomous than the ones you'll find in big cities. And I think it's partly because they feel like in these small towns they haven't won the culture war fully yet. And the fact that they feel they haven't won yet, I think makes them even more venomous. Because honestly, of the worst like liberal white women I've ever known, almost all of them were from small towns. Um, and I think there's a reason for that. Like, yeah, I mean, to be honest, of the women I've dated, I find small town women tend to be more insane. Like, they tend to be more histrionic, more prone toward crazy behavior, more untrustworthy, and more likely to stab you in the back as a man. That's just my experience. Again, like other people's experience may differ from mine, but that is honestly the experience that I've had. Maybe I'm just unlucky with small towns. I mean, again, there's also in my own personal family history, like there've been certain people in small towns who have been abusive, very abusive, like emotionally, psychologically abusive, who are in small towns, who lived in small towns. Like this is a trend that has existed within my own family also. Um, so yeah, honestly, I don't know, like this idealization of rural areas and small towns by the right is simply something that, frankly, it doesn't meet the reality. Like, I guess, yes, these towns are, and these rural areas are whiter and more conservative on average, but at the end of the day, they do have their problems. And another problem, as I've touched on, is that you do have to pretty much drive everywhere. So, I mean, some towns, if they're small enough, you can just walk from one end to the other or bike from one end to the other. But like, if it's a place that's a bit bigger, like let's say a place that's between like 15,000 to 50,000, then it's big enough that you can't just simply walk around, but it's probably not going to have much public transit either. Maybe some shitty buses that come infrequently, but beyond that, nothing really. So, again, these are all things that you have to consider. And another is that, frankly, these places are often just kind of boring. Like as I said, they don't have much in the way of parks and trails, but there also won't be much in terms of like, museums, art galleries, historic sites. I mean, most small towns. There's a few small towns that are pretty historic, but the average one, it won't have that much in terms of cultural attractions, in terms of like libraries. The library system may not be that good. Uh, you may not be able to buy a lot of things. The restaurants might be lacking in variety to some extent. I mean, and I'm not even talking about like, I'm talking about like even if you want to get some decent like Greek food, it might be hard in some of these places, or even like, you know, Neapolitan style pizza, like Italian food that isn't totally North Americanized. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of issues with small towns, and I'm not saying there's nothing good about them. I'm just saying that like people on the right, they tend to idealize rural areas and small towns and they don't look at the negatives, whereas they do the opposite for the cities, which is they focus entirely on the negatives and they don't look at the positives. Like many cities have great architecture, great museums, great cultural attractions, um, great restaurants, and a lot of other things like that. They're also often hubs of like science and research and things like that. Like there's a lot of good things about cities and having better public transit also. Like there's a lot of good things about cities that people on the right ignore, and then there's a lot of bad things about rural areas and small towns that people on the right ignore. So I'm kind of just trying to paint a more balanced picture here.